Have you ever felt like the walls of your own life were closing in on you, and the people you trusted the most were the ones pushing them in? That's how I felt sitting in the sterile waiting room of St. Luke's Hospital in Birmingham, where my mother's life hung by a thread. The sound of fluorescent lights buzzing above was the only noise in the space, but my heart was beating so loudly I could barely hear my thoughts. For the 6th time in less than an hour, I tried calling him Douglas, my husband, the man I once thought I knew, the man who, just years ago, had shared my father's passion for the family estate, the legacy we'd protected for generations. Now he couldn't even spare a moment to be there for me. "Virginia, what is it now?" His voice was cold, distant, and filled with irritation. "I am in an important meeting." I swallowed hard, trying to fight the lump in my throat. "Mum's being rushed into emergency surgery. I need you here." The response came almost immediately, as if my desperation meant nothing. "Sorry, can't make it. Big things happening. Handle it yourself." And just like that, my world crumbled. My mother, the woman who had held the family together through years of laughter and tears, was in critical condition, and my husband? He was nowhere to be found. But it wasn't just the phone call that shattered me. It was the cold text that came minutes later from Douglas himself. "Secured my future. Just sold the estate. Leaving for Brazil tonight with someone who actually makes me happy. Goodbye." I read the message in silence. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, but I didn't. Instead, a calm, almost surreal feeling washed over me. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a calculated attack on everything I had ever loved, on everything my family had built. You see, that estate, our Victorian home, wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was history, our family's heart and soul. It had been in our blood for generations. When my father passed away, my mother and I inherited it together. But now, in the darkest moment of my life, my husband had betrayed us, selling our legacy without a second thought. Little did he know, I had been watching him, and I wasn't the one who would lose this battle. As I sat there, waiting, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the distant beep of medical equipment became a haunting reminder of how fragile life truly was. My mind drifted back to quieter, happier times, before the chaos, before the betrayal. I could still see it clearly in my mind's eye, the old Victorian estate where I grew up, the tall, grand windows that framed the sprawling garden my mother had tended for decades, the sound of my father's laughter echoing down the long, creaky halls. Those were the days when life felt simple, when everything had a place, and we all knew who we were. Our family estate wasn't just a home, it was our legacy. It was everything. And I could still smell the roses in the garden, my mother's favourite scent carried in by the summer breeze. I could still hear my grandmother's voice, soft and full of wisdom, as she sat by the fire in the library, telling me stories about our ancestors. "Virginia," she'd say, "family isn't just about blood. It's about trust, and it's about protecting what matters most." Those words stayed with me, always. My mother and I, we shared the weight of that estate, our bond strengthened by the house that had been passed down from generation to generation. After my father passed, the house became even more important. It was our history, our heart. My mother and I became the keepers of that history, the guardians of the legacy. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Douglas, my husband, was once the man who shared that vision with me. He'd been there during those early years, helping my mother in the garden, asking questions about the history of the house. He'd understood, or so I thought. He used to bring my father coffee during long talks about estate management, his eyes lighting up with excitement as he asked how he could help, eager to learn. When we married, I thought I'd found someone who shared my values, someone who understood what it meant to protect this house, this family. But over time, he began to change. Little by little, he became someone I didn't recognize. 5 years ago, when my father passed, something in Douglas shifted. The warmth in his eyes turned cold. He started spending more time at the office, coming home later and later. The laughter that once filled our home became a rare sound. I noticed the changes at first. Small things missing around the house. Antique pieces, family jewellery. He'd claimed they were just being appraised, that we needed to clear out the old to make room for the new. But I didn't believe him. It wasn't until 2 months ago that I discovered receipts for a luxury condo in Rio de Janeiro, Douglas's secret life. That was when I hired Juliana, the private investigator. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I needed answers. What I found was more than I could have imagined. Douglas had been showing potential buyers forged documents, claiming full ownership of our estate. He thought he could sell it out from under me, thinking I would be too distracted with my mother's health to notice. He had no idea that my grandmother had been steps ahead of him, setting up an irrevocable trust long before Douglas came into our lives. The irony was almost laughable if it weren't so painful. The house that meant everything to me, the house that held my family's memories, was about to be torn from my hands. And Douglas, he thought he'd won. He thought he'd beaten me at my own game. But he was wrong. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Douglas wasn't just stealing from me. He was planning to destroy everything my family had worked for. I remember the day Juliana, my private investigator, called me with the news. "Virginia, I need you to see something," she said, her voice urgent. "Check your email." I quickly opened the attachment, my fingers trembling as I clicked on the first photo. It was Douglas sitting at an expensive restaurant with his secretary, Angela, laughing like everything was normal. My stomach churned. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the stack of documents sitting on the table, documents with my name on them. My heart raced as I realised what they were. Forged papers, transferring ownership of the estate. I scrolled through the photos, each one worse than the last. There were receipts for expensive shopping trips, more dinners with Angela, and meetings with shady real estate agents. But what made my blood run cold was what I found next. He had been systematically draining our accounts, my personal accounts, the joint ones we shared, emptying them into offshore accounts. Every penny we had worked so hard for, all gone. I opened my banking app. The balance in my personal account, just $842. The joint account? Completely wiped out. The tears I'd been holding back for hours finally fell, but they weren't from sadness. They were from anger, a fury I could no longer ignore. This wasn't just betrayal. This was calculated. This was everything my family had spent decades building, being torn apart by the man who promised to protect it. I leaned back in the chair, gripping my grandmother's leather-bound diary in my hands. It had been my grandmother's voice I heard in my head as I stared at the empty accounts. Family is about trust, Virginia, and trust is everything. I had always trusted Douglas, but trust, as it turns out, is a fragile thing. The irony wasn't lost on me. My grandmother had set up the trust for the estate long before Douglas and I had even met, ensuring that the family's legacy would be protected no matter what happened. She'd known. She had seen the signs. She knew that greed could tear apart even the closest families. But Douglas didn't know that. He didn't know about the trust. He didn't know that everything he was doing was already being watched. I'd hired Juliana not just to uncover his affair, but to track his every move. I'd gathered everything, every piece of evidence I could find. It was all coming together now, and I was ready to make my move. Then came the message that would change everything. "By the way," Douglas texted, "I took care of those dusty old photo albums in the library. Nobody needs that sentimental junk anymore. The buyers want the house empty by next week." My heart stopped. The photo albums, my mother's precious memories, the history of our family, gone. It was too much. I couldn't sit back any longer. The man I had once called my husband was not just taking my family's money, he was erasing us, erasing everything we had ever stood for, and I would not let him. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the documents Juliana had gathered. Every forged signature, every transfer. It was all there, laid out in front of me. I was about to destroy him, legally, financially, and in ways he could never imagine. But just as I was preparing to act, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was another text from Douglas. "I've secured everything. The estate's gone. We're free to start our new life. You'll thank me when you see how much I got for that old house." The smugness in his words only fueled my resolve. He had no idea what was coming. I smiled grimly and began to dial. I couldn't wait any longer. I was ready to take back what was ours. But I had to be smart about it. This wasn't just about vengeance. It was about securing my family's future and ensuring that the trust my grandmother had set up was never in danger. I needed to move fast. I called Mr. Reynolds, the buyer Douglas had arranged for the estate. His voice was smooth, confident, too confident. "Mrs. Crawford, I understand you're calling to finalise the details for the estate," he said. "Your husband mentioned you would be in touch. $3.2 million is a steal for such a beautiful property, and the paperwork's all ready to go." I could feel my blood boil, but I kept my voice steady, calm. "Mr. Reynolds," I said, "I suggest you contact your bank immediately and stop the transfer. The sale is fraudulent." There was a long pause on the line. His voice faltered just a bit as he tried to recover. "What do you mean?" "The paperwork's all been signed. Your husband insisted on immediate payment." I smiled, the feeling of control washing over me. "The property is in an irrevocable trust," I replied, "and any sale without the proper documentation from the trust administrator is illegal." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. You're telling me the sale is invalid?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," I said, my voice unwavering. "I suggest you check your purchase agreement very carefully. You'll find that it's filled with irregularities." I could almost hear him panicking as I spoke. I wasn't done yet, though. I had more than just words. I had the truth on my side. "And just so you know," I continued, "you're an unwitting participant in real estate fraud. I'm sure you wouldn't want that on your record." The line went silent for a moment. Then Mr. Reynolds spoke again, this time with a tone of disbelief. "You're telling me that your husband—" "He doesn't have the authority to sell the estate," I interrupted, "and you're going to want to speak to your lawyer immediately." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. I'd just set the trap. Now all I had to do was watch it unfold. Moments later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Juliana. "Virginia, I've got something for you. You need to see this right now." I quickly opened the email she had sent me, my hands shaking as I read the new information she'd uncovered. There were photos, more of Douglas and Angela, this time showing them celebrating, loading boxes of our family's belongings into a car. The champagne glasses in their hands only served to emphasize the cruelty of it all. They were laughing, enjoying their stolen victory, while my mother fought for her life in the ICU. But that wasn't the worst part. "The buyers want the house empty by next week," Douglas had said. He didn't just want the house. He wanted to erase our history, our memories. And he was going to do it while we were distracted, while my mother was in surgery. I couldn't let that happen. Juliana's voice was urgent as she continued. Virginia, he's been recording your calls with the hospital. He wanted to make sure you wouldn't notice what he was doing while your mother was too ill to interfere. I felt a cold rage settle deep within me. He had been watching my every move, knowing exactly how to strike when I was most vulnerable. He thought I wouldn't notice. He thought I wouldn't fight back. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. I glanced at my mother's bed, her fragile form resting peacefully after surgery. The doctors had told me it would be a long recovery, but she was a fighter. And so was I. I wasn't just going to let him take everything. I wasn't going to let him destroy what we had. I had my grandmother's trust to back me up. I had the law on my side, and I had the evidence to prove it. As I prepared to make my next move, my phone buzzed once more. This time it was another text from Douglas, taunting me. By the way, it read, I took care of those dusty old photo albums in the library. Nobody needs that sentimental junk anymore. The buyers want the house empty by next week. I felt a sharp pain in my chest as I read those words. He didn't just want to steal our money. He wanted to erase everything that had ever mattered to us. The photos, the memories, my mother's life's work. It was all going to be gone just like that. But not if I had anything to say about it. I made the call. As I watched the security camera footage, my heart pounded in my chest. Angela, looking every bit the part of the conniving accomplice, was scrambling to destroy the evidence in my husband's study. But what she didn't know was that every movement, every action was being monitored. My grandmother's foresight had spared us all. It wasn't just the trust that protected us. It was the systems my grandmother had put in place long before any of this had ever come to pass. She knew how dangerous greed could be. She knew how people would exploit the most vulnerable times in your life, when you're grieving, when you're distracted by the fear of losing someone you love. And she had been right. I sat back in my chair, still clutching my grandmother's diary, now more precious to me than ever. She had been the heart of our family, and it was her wisdom that had guided me through this nightmare. It was her legacy that I was now protecting, not just from Douglas and Angela, but from the very forces that sought to destroy what we held dear. In that moment, I realized something important. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in fighting back with fire and fury. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting your enemies destroy themselves. Douglas had thought he was in control. He thought that by selling the estate, draining our accounts, and erasing our history, he would be free to live his life without consequences. But he had underestimated something critical: the strength of family. The bonds that tied us together were far stronger than any betrayal, any deception, or any amount of money. As the police closed in on Douglas and Angela, I realized that the real power wasn't in the money, the estate, or the property. It was in the values that had been passed down to me, values that had been instilled by my grandmother, values that Douglas never understood. My family's legacy wasn't just in the house, the land, or the wealth. It was in the memories we shared, the lessons we learned, and the trust we held in one another. Douglas thought he could erase all of that, but what he didn't know was that our legacy had already been preserved, not just by a trust, but by our hearts, our memories, and our commitment to each other. He had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated us. He thought he could tear us apart, but he only made us stronger. He didn't realize that the real value of the estate wasn't in its price tag. It was in what it represented: our family's history, our shared moments, and the bond we held as a family. And now, with Douglas and Angela trapped by their own greed, I could finally see the truth. Sometimes it's not about winning. It's about preserving what really matters. It's about protecting the things you hold dear, even when it seems like everything is falling apart. I smiled softly as I watched the security feed, knowing that our legacy was safe, that the house would stand for generations to come. It wasn't just a building. It was a living testament to everything we had fought for, everything my family had stood for, and it would continue to stand long after Douglas and Angela had gone. A few weeks later, as I sat in the courthouse watching Douglas and Angela stand before the judge, I couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet satisfaction. Gone were the confident, self-assured expressions on their faces. In their place, prison jumpsuits and defeated gazes. The once smug, arrogant pair now looked like mere shadows of the people they had been, broken by their own deceit. The prosecutor's voice was steady and strong as he read out the charges: fraud, conspiracy, theft. The list went on, each word a reminder of the destruction they had caused, not just to me, but to so many others. The evidence we had gathered, the forged documents, the bank statements, the photos, had sealed their fate. It was only a matter of time before they would answer for what they had done. I glanced down at the small folder in my lap. Inside, a document that meant everything. The original will, my grandmother's final testament. The will that Douglas had believed to be lost, but was, in fact, carefully preserved. He had never understood that the true value of our family's wealth wasn't in the money. It was in the legacy we carried with us, our values, our memories, and the history we had built. I couldn't help but smile as I thought about how far I had come. I had walked through the fire and emerged stronger. I had faced the man I had once loved, the man who had betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. And yet, through it all, I had remained true to myself, to my family, to the lessons that had been passed down through generations. I thought of my mother recovering in her room at home, surrounded by the things that truly mattered. The family photos, the heirlooms, the memories that no amount of money or greed could ever take away. The house was still standing, our family's home, and it would continue to stand just as it always had, strong, enduring, a symbol of everything we had fought for. "Your Honour," Douglas's lawyer began, his voice trembling slightly, "my client was simply trying to protect his wife's assets. He never intended for things to go this far." The prosecutor cut him off, holding up a thick folder filled with documents. "Your Honour, the evidence shows otherwise. Mr. Crawford was targeting vulnerable families during times of medical emergencies, forging power of attorney documents, and stealing their estates. His actions have caused irreparable harm to numerous families. As the judge set bail at $5 million for each of them, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. They had tried to take everything from us, but in the end it wasn't the money or the estate or the house that mattered. It was the truth, and the truth had prevailed. As they were led away, I sat back in my chair, taking a deep breath. The battle was over, but the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in knowing that the legacy my family had built was safe, that no amount of greed, no matter how deep, could ever destroy what was truly important. In that moment, I knew I had done more than just protect an estate. I had protected the very soul of my family. And that was the greatest victory of all.